Welcome to the next edition of our interview series on personal histories and conflict resolution. Today, we speak with Howard Bellman, who has mediated in nearly every category of disputes with concentrations on labor, the environment, and public policy. Howard's practice has been nationwide and international. He's held leadership positions in professional organizations, taught courses, and lectured at universities around the world, and published in scholarly and professional journals. He served as secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Industry, Labor, and Human Relations, and commissioner of the Wisconsin Employment Relations Commission. He received a law degree from the University of Cincinnati and an LLM in labor law from New York University. One of the things you talk about, and I think this is a conversation you and I have had, as someone who came to the field in the 80s, I think I often think about the beginning of ADR as Frank Sander and the Pound Conference and the community mediation movement. But I've learned over time about the rich history in the field that comes from the labor movement. So let's go back. You were talking before about NYU and your LLM and your time at the NLRB in Detroit. I mean, this was, and you said, you refer to yourself, pardon my French, I'm quoting you, as being as content as a pig in shit. So it felt like you were in the right place at the right time in the emergence of some of this work. And I just want you to take us back to that time period and what it sort of felt like. You know, that was what the mediation movement was. It was labor at that time.
And had been for decades.
Right.
Okay. So the history of labor mediation goes back to the birth of the nation, almost. Mm-hmm. In some very simple terms, but there was a federal mediation and conciliation service and lots of state agencies that did labor mediation since the 1930s. So it offends me to be really just blunt about it that people think it was invented in the late 1970s. I mean, that just offends me because the people that I worked with as labor mediators were very good at it. I mean, they were really good at it. And they didn't get any intellectual input whatsoever. There was no academic activity. There was maybe one book that was written by William Simpkin. And I eventually discovered that there was one law review article written by Lon Fuller, and that was the literature. Wow. Okay. And nobody in Cambridge, Massachusetts had any notion of what was going on, apparently, or cared about it for one reason or another. Mm-hmm. So I spent a couple of years in Detroit working for the Labor Board, which is a regulatory agency for those of you who are not of the United States. And I did investigations, and I represented the general counsel as a trial lawyer, and I ran elections among workers and that sort of thing for a couple of years. And I will tell you that the American labor movement was at its peak. It was never higher in terms of representing the numbers of people than it was at that time. And in the city where I was, there was iconic labor unions and leaders who some of you will remember. One of them was Jimmy Hoffa, another one of them was Walter Reuther. And there was a lot of action there, and it was really interesting, and it was really dynamic and exciting. Mm-hmm. But elsewhere in the United States, the public sector was organizing. Mm-hmm. And the leading edge of the public sector organizing was in Wisconsin. So I came here to Madison, Wisconsin, to work for the state. And in my job working for the state, I was asked to do mediation and arbitration, as well as to be administrative law judge.
So that was work, the Wisconsin Employment Relations Commission.
Right, which it turns out, as I said in the article, to really be my alma mater. It was a wonderful place. It was an elite agency with wonderful colleagues, and they trained me by letting me walk around, go to meetings with them, okay? But that was the training I got. There was nothing for me to read. There were no experts for me to watch on tape, so there was nothing. There was just me and my senior colleagues who were eager to help me out and encourage me, and they did. And I learned how to do it by mimicking them and applying whatever natural instincts and gifts I came to the job with. Okay, and I stayed at that for about 11 years. Okay, so I was very happy to do that. I felt like I was on the leading edge again because the public sector was developing, because Wisconsin was a laboratory state in those days. And I was working with people that I was proud to work with. And I developed a perspective on being a mediator, from being there among those people, that has never left me. No matter what I've done since then,
Mhm.
that's at the heart of my perspective on all the other work that I've done. And I'll say that I've done damn near every other kind of work by now.
Well, we're going to get into that too.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting because I have not done collective bargaining. I've not done labor work. And I think that before I knew much about it, it seemed to me, well, isn't it the same thing over and over again? You have labor and management, you're negotiating these agreements. But in the chapter, you make clear, yes, it was labor management negotiations for collective bargaining agreements, but you worked with symphonies and ballet companies and foundries and factories and teachers and firefighters and university faculties and grave diggers. I mean, so every case must have been entirely different, even though you're dealing with the same topic of figuring out what these labor management agreements were going to be. I mean, there's got to be a wild variation between each of these conversations.
Yeah, that is true. And I would I would just say that again, this didn't dawn on me early on, but I realized eventually that I was having what were essentially cross-cultural experiences.
Mm.
Because when I was working with a ballet company, I mean, I'd seen the ballet, but that was about it.
Right.
When I worked with the gravediggers, likewise, or people who worked in sewers or people who work in foundries, none of that was in my background.
Yeah.
But there were customs and norms and language and all the things that you encounter when you move. Now I know that when you move from culture to culture. So it may not have been as stark or as vivid or as obvious, but I was learning to adjust to their various contexts.
Right.
I was learning that I had to work in various contexts, and eventually learned that I actually could do that. I mean, I had the capacity to do that. It became clear to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sooner or later. Yeah.
And I think sometimes when we talk about culture, we think too narrowly about culture as
Yeah.
being an economic issue or a ethnic issue or a regional issue. But no, there are cultures that exist even within one company. You can have the guys in the warehouse, and you can have the blue collar guys, and you can have the executives, and they all have different cultures. So that's what I hear you saying.
Well, not to mention so I was moving from one end of Wisconsin to another, and in every nook and cranny, because
right.
there are teachers, for example, in every nook and cranny, and other kinds of sort of things that are local.
Yeah.
And so even moving around within the state of Wisconsin, maybe even moving around within Milwaukee,
Mm-hmm.
you would have all manner of diversity
Mm-hmm.
that I would have to adjust to, or that I would have to understand, involved people whose worldview was different than my own.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so now I want to talk about the move from work to WCPP, the Wisconsin Center for Public Policy, because this is a chapter I'm particularly interested in. I find there's a lot of mediators that haven't had this experience of doing mediation work in the public policy sphere, and I feel like doing the pardon the pun, the work at work, you were sort of inventing it. You were cutting the ice. There wasn't a lot of literature. There weren't a lot of training materials. There wasn't this rich literature you could draw upon. But then I sort of feel like the field starts to formalize a little bit. And then, while you think about Frank's talk at the Pound Conference, that was 77 in St. Paul, right? So you were talking with him at that exact time period. So what did that feel like to move from, negotiating with the gravediggers to moving into more public policy kind of conversations?
Well, what had happened is that I had moved from being a staff member of the commission to being a member of the commission itself. The governor appointed me as one of the three people who were the head of the agency. Mm-hmm. And so I had a little taste, a little sort of, I had a foot in politics by that time, because I had become a political appointee.
Sure.
And with a foot in politics, I got to meet people who had both feet in politics. And one of them invited me to leave the government and join him in forming this think tank, which, as I said in the article, was a bit of a pretext because although some of us, including myself, did some research and had some real grants to do experimental work, it was also a bit of a front for political activity, managing people's campaigns and the like.
I see.
So I sort of moved slowly into political life in the state. And in that way, and with those contacts, I had conversations with people who had been my colleagues in leading state agencies in the past, one of whom was the head of the Department of Natural Resources, who came to me and said, and I have to tell you, this is one of those phone calls that comes into your life the way I suppose lightning does when it hits you on the golf course, right? Okay, so anyway, I get this phone call, and the phone call said, how would you like, this is a person who knew me as a mediator from a few years ago and knew me as a person from sort of the same political team, and said to me, would you mediate a waste load allocation case on the Fox River? And all I can tell you is that I knew what the Fox River was. I had no idea what a waste load allocation was or anything about environmental law or anything of the sort. But I said, sure. Yes. I said, sure, why not?
That's
right?
Great.
And I had some other friends with similar work. So without any sort of real effort or marketing or sort of insights of my own, I started getting a caseload of environmental cases from the Department of Natural Resources and the Public Service Commission of the state of Wisconsin. And at that point in time, another one of these sort of, being at the right place at the right time things, the Ford Foundation was looking for people like me because the Ford Foundation was funding mediators in environmental work for reasons of their own at the time. Okay, and so they were very generously supported me and a few other people that you and I know who were the earliest of the environmental mediators in the United States. And I began to do what I knew how to do, which was labor mediation, except in environmental cases, which of course is ridiculous, okay, because there are fundamental differences that were constantly pointed out to me by people who were scoffing at the idea that I could do anything in environmental affairs. But one way or another, talking to the other people that you and I know who were also sort of floundering around trying to do this, and just applying some intuitions of my own, I was able to tailor what I did to the realities of environmental cases.
Sure.
And have a body of success all around the United States, actually. I didn't have much competition, so I could go everywhere. And established myself, I think, as a successful environmental mediator. Absolutely. Just that way. It was a very large component of dumb luck. Okay. But that was something I was able to do because I was at this sort of this foundation supported place with foundation support with a grant from the Ford Foundation. And in the meantime, also starting my own private practice as a mediator and as an arbitrator. So at some point I came to the conclusion that I had this sort of tailoring capacity. I could take the thing that I knew, the ethics and the techniques that I had learned at the Employment Relations Commission and labor work, and tailor them so that they could apply successfully to the needs of other kinds of cases. Yeah. At some point, just to close this off, Colin, at some point, Frank Sander, who meant nothing to me at the time, okay, I'd left academics behind a very long time ago. I had no particular attachment to the practice of law, and Frank Sanders showed up in my office. Okay, I didn't realize who I was with, to be honest with you, and he was asking me how I did what I do. He was asking me about it. little did I know, what actually was transpiring in that conversation. And subsequently, he became the father of ADR.
Well, one father of ADR, but yes,
Well, yeah,
yeah,
but no,
sure.
well, I mean, I've heard him described that way, and I
Yeah.
think he probably earned it. But the point is that I guess I knew him before conception or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's it. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, it's interesting to extend the jazz metaphor. It's almost like you were playing kind of old school New Orleans Preservation Hall jazz, and then somebody invited you to a bossa nova show and said, "Hey, do you want to sit in?" And you're like, "Wow, I've never done this before, but sure, why not?" And yes, some of the skills that you had, some of it was enough to get you going, and then you could figure out the things that you had to figure out moving forward. So,
yeah,
another, yeah. And I do want to open it up because we have so much expertise on the call here that I think I feel a little bit selfish asking you all the questions, even though I have so many good questions to ask. But there's one other, and I mentioned this to you before on our prior call. In your chapter, you talked about after you made the move over to WCPP and you started to do more public policy stuff, you were interacting with colleagues who were not labor people. And your passage, I love this. You said, my new colleagues generally were not former labor mediators, and some were not lawyers. Some were planners, and some came from other disciplines. Worse yet, they were comfortable with non-agreement seeking public engagement processes. They did not share my assumptions, and their ideas of best practices seemed heterodox and dubious. So I just thought that was interesting because, yeah, the field is widening, and now you have people coming in from very different orientations. And I'm sure, based on all of the hard work you had done in the labor sector, some of what they were doing seemed kind of untethered. So, how did that feel to have the field widen at that moment?
well, first of all, I'll say by way of confession that I blossomed as a snob at that point. Okay, and I was in that position of saying, well, that's not really mediation. And Ann Milne may remember that we all went to a conference of the family mediators, and I was asked about what they were thinking about doing in mediating in custody cases and so on. And I said, well, it sounds like you're doing good work, but it's not mediation.
Right. You said
And
you
I
can't
actually,
paint it green and call it grass.
yeah, I said you can't paint it green and call it grass. And now that embarrasses me. Okay.
Hmm.
So what happened is that um, I looked down on people who were not agreement seekers. And as you'll see in the article, I looked down at people who stood in the front of the room with butcher paper on the wall and wrote on the wall and made a lot of notes and then took it down from the masking tape and all that sort of stuff. It looked to me like their skill was mainly in holding a lot of markers at the same time.
Hmm.
It didn't seem to me as appealing or as something as the kind of work I'd seen my colleagues do in labor relations, where we stayed up all night and we kept people from going out on strike, and we got things done for the community,
Right.
and we suffered along with everybody else in the room. And this seemed to be a little too elegant for my taste, and so I was disparaging of it. Sooner or later, because the Ford Foundation supported conversations among that diverse group, I realized I was dealing with a lot of people who are smarter than I am and who are as least as well intended as I am, and we're getting things done. Okay, so I had to drop my attitude and become more of a listener to them, as opposed to telling them that they were sort of out of their league.
Sure.
And that's what happened. And in the so, and you know this as well as I do, because you and I have actually done this. In the process of telling people how they ought to do things and then listening to their response, you actually learn something. and and that goes on forever. Okay, I mean, I'm still doing that, and so um, one of the things that I discovered in that way was that what I was doing in environmental mediation really wasn't environmental at all. It was just some way of dealing with larger groups,
Mm-hmm.
and dealing with larger groups who had a problem of public consequence.
Mm.
And so we began to do processes that were not environmental by any description, but were in social services or were in
Sure.
education or other areas of public concern. And that eventually that eventually blossomed into negotiated rulemaking, among other things,
Absolutely.
which
And
is where I think I landed actually
right.
by now. Yeah.
Well, I do actually want to talk about Regneg and Phil Harder and all of that work because it's very exciting. But yeah, and also, again, you embraced sort of an academic role, and you've been an adjunct at Marquette, right, for years and years, and you've done international work in Canada, England, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, South Africa, Japan. You've worked with American Indian tribes, so I feel like your expansion from labor to all of these other application areas also tracked the very development of the mediation field, which was labor focused, and it blossomed at the same time your career was blossoming, and you were opening up some of these other application areas. All right, well, I'm going to open it up to everyone because I want to get some questions from the audience. If you want to put something in the chat, that's fine. I see some hands raised, so maybe we could go to Philip first. Philip, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to make a comment?
Thanks, Colin and Howard. That was really fascinating. I just want to ask about your view on subject matter expertise, because I have a lot of debates, particularly with retired judges, on this issue, and they assert that a good mediator can mediate anything well. And I say, whilst that's true, subject matter expertise surely enables the mediator to generate options more relevant to the dispute, whereas subject matter ignorance must surely constrain your ability to generate options that the parties hadn't thought of. So just be interested in your view on that relatively simple debate.
Yeah, I don't think it's simple, and that's why it's a wonderful question. I think that everybody is right in that case, which is a wonderful mediator thing to say, right? So I think that in at least in American culture, expertise is equated with specializing. I don't care if you're a doctor, a lawyer, an architect, whatever you are. If you specialize, people think you're an expert. I also think, however, despite that assumption, that presumption, that those of us who are general practitioners can bring to the case processes and ideas and experiences that we had outside of the box that the case is in, which can be what makes the case work, actually, because our job is to penetrate to find out what's really going on. And once you find out, we all know this, what's really going on, it's not what was presented in the first place. And now you need ideas that are not the ideas that you thought were relevant when you got there. Okay, that's really good mediation. That's reframing. That's getting to the bottom of things. So I have some concern but the marketplace, which I find I'm often in conflict with, that the marketplace does equate expertise with specialization. I think it does that for the very reasons that you just said, because you come with a deeper experience, a more extensive experience in the very kind of problem that you're dealing with. And so I think there is an unresolvable ambiguity there. If you actually wind up in a case that is in fact about what you thought it was going to be about, it's very likely that greater expertise will apply in a very valuable way. But in the most interesting cases that I think of, you find out that the case is not exactly about what you thought it was going to be about, and now you need to know something else. And one of the things you need to know is how to pivot and reframe the case and change what you're doing. So if I don't think there is I don't think there's a resolution to the problem. And the only thing that I can counsel you with, for what it's worth, is that I think those of us who are dedicated lifelong mediators become more comfortable than other people do with ambiguity. So good luck with that is all I can say. I think we need to be comfortable with ambiguity, and that we need to know how to pivot.
Well, fabulous answer. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Howard, I've seen disputes where all the experts have worked very hard to see a problem very clearly, but they see it all the same way. And that's one of the reasons why they can't find a way out of a problem, because everyone's thinking about it the same way. So if you look for a neutral or a facilitator that has that same expertise, they're going to be locked again into the same frame. and maybe bringing someone who has an outside perspective and doesn't share that expertise can enable them to see it from different angles and provide some of the ambiguity that can generate options.
So I like to refer back to certain sort of crude, sort of primitive expressions from my labor days. And one of them is, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay. And sometimes you need a wrench or something else. And so I do think that, I mean, it's just a good question. And there are a lot of good questions that might be put to me that I have to answer in this way, because they don't really resolve. I don't know the answer.
Sure. Well, that's why we're here, is to hit you with difficult, unresolvable questions. Let's go to Vikram. Vikram, I see your hands up. What comment would you like?
Thanks, Colin. I'm just sorry about not putting the video on. It's at 11:30 at night. Look, you don't want to see that. But Howard, you said you're not comfortable with co-mediating. And why were you comfortable with Susan? Can you just put something on that?
Wow, you really read the article. I'm comfortable. I don't know. Really, I don't know the question. Once again, I have to answer that I don't really know the answer. I can only tell you that I have tried to co-mediate with lots of people, and I don't do it well, and I'm not comfortable with it, and I grow to dislike the person I'm working with, and no doubt they grow to dislike me. So I don't play well with others or something. I don't know exactly what it is. I don't criticize the notion of co-mediating. I just know that it isn't a good idea for me. However, in some very complicated cases where you have 25 or 30 parties, it's very useful, to put it mildly, to have someone to work with for any number of reasons. And what I found is with that particular person, who's Susan Podziba, not only we are sort of generally on the same wavelength. I don't hear her say, when she says something, I never hear her saying something that makes me cringe. And when I say something that makes her cringe, she has a very nice way of saying to the group what Howard really meant was, right? So I appreciate all of that. I appreciate that somehow or other we're on the same wavelength, and she's also has a way, she finesses sometimes the things that I do, because I'm at times impulsive. I think when you're improvising and you're comfortable with the notion that you're improvising, there's a high percentage of times when something's going to come out of your mouth that you regret. And I will confess to having done that more than a few times. And it's very nice to have somebody who knows how to sort of smooth that out for you and keep the process going. And she's able to do that. But otherwise, I can only, I don't know. I don't really know what it is. If you, in the article, you'll see there are a couple of questions, so sort of self-questioning that I do. One of them is, why can I only work with her? And the other one was, why is it I get along so well with bad people? Okay, and I'm working on both of those. Particularly the latter is actually more interesting to me, and I am working on that one. I think that's a really interesting question.
I'm tempted to go deeper into that. You just opened a big door, but I'm going to ignore that for now, and let's go to Jerry. And Jerry, what comment did you want to make?
Well, I did read the article and I enjoyed it, and I'm appreciating how Colin's leading you sort of out of the box, where you're looking at the limitations of certain specialized expertise. My question sort of typically comes from California. It's about whether you have come across the work of Marshall Rosenberg and the ideas of nonviolent communication. I can imagine they haven't been part of your work, but they're rather popular in conflict resolution circles, mostly, well, professionally and unprofessionally.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to your question is I'm not familiar with her work, but I am familiar with the sort of what I would describe as a sort of California school.
How would you describe that?
It's more psychological than I am. Okay, and so, for example, Colin's previous interview was with Howard Gadlin, who's a favorite person of all of ours. And one of the things that he made a point of was his background as a psychologist, and actually spent a lot of time at UCLA as the ombudsman and so on and so forth. And it's very clear that although Howard and I are on the same wavelength and very, very many things, we are both informed by how we were trained. And so people in California, I think in many ways seem to be, particularly the people who are sort of identified as leaders in a historic sense of mediation in California, seem to have been trained in psychology and the like, those social sciences. And so they come at the field in a way that reflects that, just as I come at the field in a way that reflects what goes on in collective bargaining. And to be really sort of, I don't know, I hope not vulgar about it, it feels touchy-feely to me. Okay. Okay. I don't want to offend anybody, and I don't want to be a snob. I don't want to continue to be a snob about things.
No. It's not about one being better than the other. I think it's about two different orientations.
Right. I'm not grounded in that sort of thing. But to be more to the point, I don't see how those approaches can serve in the broad spectrum of cases that I like to do. I can see how they serve in particular cases where individual relationships are at the heart of the matter. Okay,
Yeah,
or where people's emotions are at the heart of the matter.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And Marshall Rosenberg was indeed a psychologist. If I can mention another proponent of conflict resolution, comes more from the East Coast, University of Chicago not law professor, but sociologist Don Levine was also a student and a teacher of Aikido, which is even more touchy-feely. It's an embodied practice, but it's called the martial art of peace. It's about conflict resolution, not killing your enemy. And he wanted to introduce Aikido philosophy into sociology. So I'm actually interested in the application of Aikido principles philosophically to conflict resolution, which do have to do with finding a blend between opposing forces. I guess my simple question is, have you ever heard the name Don Levine?
I have, and it's interesting because in Chicago, which is close to where I am, much closer than California, there are lots of eminent people in our field. Len Riskin comes to mind, Steve Goldberg comes to mind, and so on. There are others as well, of course. But what I want to say more specifically about all of that is that we work in niches. And I think the metaphors that we pick to inform our work are either apt or not apt to the niches in which we are working. And that's the question. Is the philosophy, is the metaphor that you're trying to sort of exploit, is it appropriate to the kind of work that you're offering to do? If it isn't, it's malpractice or some sort of crass marketing. But I would not say in the abstract that any of those things are inappropriate in some universal sense. Okay, so it's really just what Frank Sander and Steve Goldberg, two people we've already talked about, said is that you need to fit the forum to the fuss. Okay, and to me, the most valuable skill that a person in our field has is the skill of diagnosis, is the assessment process, so that you actually understand as early as you can exactly what the case is about. And then you pick the technique that fits the case. It's very much like a physician. If all you know how to do is surgery, you're going to deal with people who need to be on a diet by cutting them open. Okay? Right. So I think that what we're really talking about is the aptness of diagnosis. And what worries me are the people who don't do diagnosis because they think they have a technique that applies to everything.
Yeah, and to think about the analogies we were using before, sometimes it's a wrench, sometimes it's a hammer. You know, sometimes it's Birdland, sometimes it's free jazz. I don't think that it's necessary that we only have one model. You know, I think fitting the form to the fuss, one of Frank's insights was that we do have to think about these pockets. It also takes me back to what you were talking about, Howard, in terms of culture, is you don't want to bring, if you have to meet the parties where they are. And if you know you want to come in and talk about Aikido and you're working with gravediggers, you know, outside of Milwaukee, it might not work, but who knows? Maybe it will. You know, there's one other question I really want to ask because I see we're running out of time here. You know, Howard, you're one of the few people that actually have taken the techniques of mediation and brought them into politics successfully. And this is interesting, Jerry, because your comment made me think of this. I just read a book that talked a lot about Gary Friedman, who obviously a mediation legend, who brought mediation techniques into local government in his community of Muir Beach. And it was a disaster. It really didn't work, even though it was a relatively small community. Those techniques did not translate to a political dispute. But you talk about in '83, you were brought in by the governor to actually mediate a case between political parties. I mean, you sat down with the legislative leaders and you use your mediation techniques and you got a deal done. And I think a lot of us in the mediation field, we see the fragmentation in society and we think our skills may be relevant, but it's so difficult to think about how could we play in that field at all. And it might be that your labor background gave you the language or the cultural understanding that enabled you to make that successful transition. So I wanted you to speak to that.
Yeah, first of all, I would say the story that you're talking about, Gary Friedman, who's obviously an iconic figure in the field,
Right,
makes me want to say I rest my case. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that by the time I got to that table with the leaders of both houses and of both parties to talk about an enormous indebtedness on the part of the unemployment insurance fund in our state, I not only had maybe 15 or 20 years of experience as a mediator in one thing or another, but I also had a life in politics. To go back to the question of substantive expertise,
So you
at the
knew
very
the world,
least,
you knew the lingo, you had legitimacy. Yeah.
well, I would like to think that I have what people call savvy, which is a big deal in politics. Okay. And I think that that did inform how I interacted with those people. At the very least, it made me sure that I knew who were the big shots and who were pretending to be the big shots. Okay, and it told me where how power I knew how power was distributed, which is always important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that that experience and then the previous and all the previous experience that I've had and had later subsequent experience in negotiated rulemaking and lots of other things have made it clear to me that there is a real role for mediation in public affairs if, and this is always my major if, you do a good assessment at the threshold, because it doesn't work in every case. The point is to pick out the cases where it's going to work in the diagnostic stage.
Absolutely.
Okay, so for example, I think when I think of my work in public work, I think, for example, of working in the desegregating a school district, settling the litigation to desegregate a school district, or to work in communities where there were struggles between inner city, between a city and its suburbs. And, I mean, I've done a great deal of that. It's sort of where I think I found myself. You mean that's not the right way of putting it. The way where I landed, I think I would say in that work. And to get back to this previous question, it was probably because I had some mastery of technique, but I also had some heightened sense of the substance.
So I hear you saying that this kind of pre-situation assessment is crucial. Understanding the dynamics between the parties, understanding the environment that the conflict is taking place in. It's not a matter of coming in tabula rasa and figuring out in the room. You need to have that pre-understanding.
Well, I think that not doing an assessment would be like going to a doctor who refuses to do a diagnosis. Okay, it's just stupid. I mean, it's the embodiment of stupidity to do that. Okay, and I think that in some cases, big elaborate cases like the public policy cases, you get to set aside a period to do an assessment. It's identified as such, and then you report on it as an assessment and so on. It's very clear. But in a labor case, in lots of other small things, I mean, I do cases right now, these days, in eviction court. Okay, I mean, they couldn't be in a certain sense simpler.
Yeah.
But I still have to do an assessment. Okay, and I might have to do it in 5 minutes, or I might get a month to do it. Okay, with lots of interviews and so on. But to go ahead with a technique without knowing what the case is about,
Right.
I mean, it's like picking a highway before you pick the destination. Okay, so if there's something that I think if there's a principle that I'm confident of, it is that the assessment is the most important part of our work.
All right, that's great. Well,
Howard, I want to appreciate what you're saying here, because you often hear from experts what their expertise is without what I'm hearing from you, which is really, you need to learn the language of the parties that are in the dispute before you begin to apply your expertise.
There are so many things that happen in those initial I mean, that's a whole wonderful, there's a book there about the things that happen, the first impressions you make, the questions that you ask at the beginning, the things, your capacity to perceive what people are thinking or what they want or what makes them nervous, all the things that happen in those initial minutes or even hours that you spend with people, I think are the critical part of what we do when we're doing things that are challenging. I think that if you get a doctor to tell you the truth, what they'll tell you is that the great doctors are the great diagnosticians. And if they make the right diagnosis, you can always find a doctor who can do the surgery.
Interesting. Well, we talked before about Susan. She has a lot of mediation superpowers. But Howard, I feel like when I look at you, I see your mediation superpowers. You exude this sense of fairness and decency and just really the values of the field. I mean, it's a difficult thing to quantify. It really is, because it's not something you can teach. Maybe it comes from the decades of experience, but to be able to walk into a room and sit at a table and put everyone at ease and in 2 seconds have a conversation, I feel like it's an inspiring thing to see. And I don't mean to make you uncomfortable with compliments.
Well, you're very generous, Colin. Thank you.
Well, so let me I want to take you, because I know I'm cognizant of the time. The last paragraph of your chapter, on the top of page 53, I just was wondering if you could read from the word will the mediators of the future. It's only 3 lines down. If you could read from there to the end, I think that's a great coda to our conversation.
Yeah. So previous to that, I was expressing some concerns, and then I ask, will the mediators of the future be the masters of their instruments and the providers of the greatest value that is potential in their work, or is the potential of their work? I cannot say, but to those new to mediation and the field in general, I wish all that I have enjoyed and the joy of shared performance, inspiring and supportive colleagues, endless exploration and learning, and the occasional thrill of a challenging undertaking ending in success for all concerned.
Thank you so much, Howard, for this wonderful conversation. It's bringing me a little bit of physical pain to have to end it, because I wanted to continue. But if everyone could please join me in a round of applause for Howard and to thank him.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you all.